welcome to another Paint-A-Lore video. For those of you who haven't watched these before, the idea is simple. I'm going to talk about the lore of an existing army and paint a model from that army at the same time. Simple as it sounds. Today's choice, in case you hadn't guessed from the title and the thumbnail, is the High Elves. Oh, this is a great army with some fantastic lore behind it. I say this as somebody who's repeatedly killed my friend Michael's High Elves in our battle report videos, but go and check those out if you like. To this end, I am painting today. This is a model I actually won in the Best Painted prize in the campaign weekend that I ran up at Warhammer World. So this is the Ever Queen Allarielle. I was very proud. I was very honoured that the rest of the gamers at the event chose my army to be the best army that was there today. It was my Bretonnians, which you can see in my my battle report videos and in my Tale of Four Gamers videos. But yeah, this is the Ever Queen Allarielle. It's a beautiful model. This is the original metal miniature, not the slightly weird plastic one that they released later, that they kind of chose to copy for Total War, which always strikes me as a bit odd, as it's got by far the uglier of the two miniatures. But anyway, so we're going to crack on with painting her, and while we do, I'm going to talk to you about all things High Elves. Okay, so first things first, I'm just going to slap some Hexwraith Flame on her dress. I'm going to water this down just a touch with some water, just to get some green kind of undertones to her dress. And while I do, we'll talk a little bit about the island nation of Ulthuan. So you can't really talk about the High Elves without talking about their homeland. Ulthuan is, let's take a look at a map of it, shall we? It is suspiciously ring-shaped. Gosh, I wonder what the inspiration for much of the stuff that we will talk about with the High Elves could possibly be. No criticism, Games Workshop. If you're going to crib from the best. Yeah, the Elves of Ulthuan in their suspiciously ring-shaped homeland. This is essentially an Atlantean-style continent set in the middle of the great world pond that is the major ocean in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And Ulthuan's really kind of divided up into kind of two areas. There's the inner sea and the inner kingdoms that surround that kind of calm and placid and permanently summer-drenched inner lands. And then there's the wilder, kind of storm-racked outer lands that make up the outer kingdoms. And yeah, those are separated from the inner kingdoms by a central range of mountains that almost entirely spans the whole continent. It makes a great big circular ring all the way around from kind of the entrance to the inner sea from coast to coast. It's breached in only a few areas over near the now lost kingdom of Nagaraith. And I keep making mentions of kingdom. Ulthuan, as I say, is a continent. It is made up of a series of different kingdoms, 10 kingdoms and princedoms, ruled by overall by the Phoenix King and the Ever Queen, who I am currently in the midst of fondling with my paintbrush. Ulthuan, to give you the background of it, Ulthuan was established by the Old Ones. So this is essentially a magical kingdom dragged out of the sea by the beings that built much of the old world, and in particular built the various races, including the elves. So the kind of the backstory to the Warhammer the Old World in general is that there were these mysterious star beings who came to the old world, and using incredible technology that bordered on magic, or in fact may even have been magic, they redistributed the continents to a format that was more pleasing to them. They created a whole host of different races that they were going to scatter across that all seemed to serve a particular purpose. The first that they made, though, was the lizard men, the slan mage priests, to assist them in their endeavours, and the saurus warriors and skinks to guard or carry out the various tasks that needed to be carried out. But after they had made themselves a race of kind of super intelligent space frogs, then they went and made the elves, the Eldar race, or the Elder race, as it's sometimes known. And yeah, the elves kind of got the best of everything. They got the grace of the Old Ones. They got their magical skills. They got their skill at arms. They got their immortality. In essence, they live basically until something kills them. It's almost unheard of for them to die of much of anything. I think illness or extreme old age has accounted, I think, for one of the Phoenix Kings over the years. Oh, so she's just got some basic green on her. Get her in focus. There we go. She's got just some basic Hexwraith green on her, just to give her a little bit of an undertone to her dress. Let that dry. While she's drying, I'll just talk to you a little bit more about the High Elves. So, the High Elves came first, then the Dwarves, then the race of man, and the Halflings and Ogres are kind of some of the last races that were created by the Old Ones before the Great Catastrophe. More of that in a moment. But so Ulthuan really was kind of the centre of the old world, or the world that was in many respects. It's sat in the centre of the Great Ocean, and it's literally a magical continent. It was raised up out of the sea by the magic of the Old Ones, and it is held there even today by the magical spells and wards that have been placed on there by a group of High Elf sorcerers that are centred on an island called the Island of the Dead, right in the middle of the Inner Sea. The peaks of the mountains, therefore, that kind of divide the Inner Kingdoms from the Outer Kingdoms are saturated with magic. In fact, some of the spells that have been worked upon Ulthuan essentially channel away the winds of magic, either grounding them in the peaks of this mountain range or funneling them back into the warp gate at the North Pole to try and prevent chaos magic from saturating, wild magic really, the winds of magic from saturating the whole of the old world. So that kind of sets the scene of what we're talking about. I'm not going to go into kind of the pre-history of the Elven Kingdom. I think the Elven Kingdoms really kind of start with the first and greatest of the Phoenix Kings, and that's Anaerion. So, somewhat bizarrely, although the elves were created by the Old Ones, they didn't worship the Old Ones as deities. Instead, they had their own pantheon, although there is a suggestion, perhaps, that the gods within that pantheon might be representative of various of the Old Ones. But the names and the personalities of the elven gods does not match, for example, the 8 names and personalities of the Old Ones that are worshipped by the lizard men. So I think it seems as though the elves found their own pantheon, they found their own religion. Prince amongst the gods of the High Elves was Anaerion. He is essentially the king of the gods. They're Zeus, for want of a better word. And he's kind of a divine arbiter. That's his role. He has the power of creation at his hand. And he's represented, therefore, by the phoenix, a bird that is both dying and yet contains within it the power to self-recreate. Other gods that are vital to understanding the High Elves are Isha, kind of the goddess of mercy, and Cain. You can't really talk about the High Elves without talking about Cain. The first Phoenix King, Anaerion. Anaerion arose at a time when the Great Catastrophe had occurred. The winds of magic were running rampant across all of the old world. The Old Ones had gone. Barbarian chaos hordes were pouring out of the north. Demonic legions landed on Ulthuan and began to ravage the Outer Kingdoms. And from amongst their number, the various kings and princes of the Elven Kingdoms picked one individual, Anaerion, and he did everything he could. He went to the shrine of Anaerion and appealed to Anaerion for wisdom, for the power to defend this nation, this island of Ulthuan. There was no response. He made sacrifices. He sacrificed, a fresh lamb to Anaerion. Still no response. He made pledges and oaths to Anaerion. Still nothing. In the end, he sacrificed the only thing that held any true value, that which held the most value to him, himself, and stepped into the eternal flame that was at the heart of the shrine of Anaerion and was consumed by it, was burned up, whilst those kind of watching priests and guards stared on agog at this seemingly act of self-immolation. But at the moment of destruction, as he was at the very heart of the flame, he found himself emerging the other side, renewed and reborn, imbued with the power of Anaerion. He'd essentially been weighed in the fire, his impurities burned out, and the perfect version of himself emerged, radiating the strength of a god, for want of a better word. He essentially became a demigod at that moment, and then set out uniting the Elven Kingdoms under his leadership. He radiated this kind of godly charisma that anyone who encountered him could feel. He met and befriended the first King Calador, the king for which the kingdom of Calador is named, the first of the great dragon princes, and brought him under his banner. He met with the first ever queen, essentially the embodiment of the elven goddess Isha, the goddess of life, who was essentially in charge of this eternally and renewing grove within the heart of the Inner Kingdoms. And yeah, he drove back the forces of chaos. He drove them right out of Ulthuan. He was gifted the greatest of dragons by Calador. The smiths of Vol, the smith god, forged an unbreakable suit of dragon armour out of this rare metal that it could only be mined on Ulthuan, mithril. No, Ithilmar, in fact. Mithril's the elven version. The Tolkien version. Ithilmar, again, just juggle the letters around and call it something new. Which would not, would repel at the heat of any dragon flame, would return any blow. And with this, he drove the forces of chaos from Ulthuan right to its very limit. And then he married the Everqueen. She bore him 2 wonderful children, a son and a daughter, twins. And for a brief period, all was well. Until the forces of chaos came pouring back. It seemed as if no matter how hard he repulsed them from Ulthuan, they would come thundering back in. Just checking to see if she's still drying. And in the process, a sort of army of beastmen attacked Avalorn, the kingdom, the queendom of the Everqueen, and slew his wife, and he believed his children. And in his grief, he ventured to the very northernmost island at the rim, the northernmost rim of Ulthuan, wherein was sighted the Shrine of Cain. So in some respects, at the southernmost tip of Ulthuan, in the mouth of the entrance to the Inner Sea, you've got the Shrine of Anaerion. On the northern edge of the Inner Sea, you've got the Shrine to Isha, and then on the other side of the Great Mountains, on the outside in the wild waters of the Whirl Pond, you've got the Shrine of Cain, the god of war, the god of murder, some would say, unbridled bloodshed. At the heart of the Shrine of Cain, much like there was in the heart of Anaerion, an ever-burning flame, and in the Shrine of Isha, a wellspring of life, in the heart of the Shrine of Cain is essentially a massive black basalt block, inset in which was a sword in the stone, a literal sword in the stone. But this was not just any sword, this was a shard of the essence of killing itself. Essentially, this was a shard of death impaled into this rock, and it was having, maddened by grief, it was to this shrine that Anaerion ventured, drew forth the sword of murder, the sword of death from the shrine, and then, with this fell energy, with the power of 2 gods essentially coursing through him, Asuran and Cain, he literally drove chaos where no one could stand against him. And no one wanted to stand against him, but in some respects as well, he also unleashed a part of the elven spirit in so doing. Until then, perhaps that essence, that joy of bloodlust had still been contained within the elven race, but by drawing the sword of murder, he unleashed it. And in so doing, he rescued a beautiful elven maiden, I use the term loosely, from a chaos warband. In many respects, as you hear this story, you will come to wonder how it is she came to be with that warband, because this maiden's name was Morathi. And this new partnership settled in the kingdom of Nagaroth, in the north, Nagaraith, the north western portion of Ulthuan, probably one of the biggest kingdoms in all of Ulthuan. And there, Morathi bore Anaerion a new son, Malekith, who in many respects seemed to embody the best of his father. He had his father's charisma, he had his skill at arms, he had a gentle humour and a quick wit. And Malekith became this emissary for his father. He became a figure of great renown across the elven kingdoms as he grew to manhood. All the while, though, Anaerion was kind of carrying around him this great curse, this heavy weight that was resting upon him, that had essentially settled upon him at the point that he drew the sword of murder. And it is said that the act of drawing that sword of murder essentially laid a curse on the whole of Anaerion's line. Again, it's very Tolkien, isn't it? The final kind of step that Anaerion took in ensuring the safety of his homeland, he teamed up with Calidor, the Dragon Tamer, who's perhaps also one of the greatest mages of his age. And the two of them came up with this plan, it was Calidor's plan actually, to bind the winds of magic in a great vortex, in a spell that would, as I said, funnel them back to either the Chaos Wastes or scatter their energies across the heights of the mountain range that circled Ulthuan. And to do this, they met on the Isle of the Dead, and Anaerion essentially defended Calidor and the other highest of the elven mages against all comers. He fought against every possible force that chaos could throw at them to buy Calidor and the others time. And in so doing, he was successful. Calidor and the others essentially created their great enchantment that froze them in time on the Isle of the Dead, in the very heart of the Inner Sea, but in so doing bound the winds of magic and settled them across the old world. That's essentially what allowed the old world to persist for as long as it did, for thousands of years. Then the winds of magic were settled and the chaos wastes were held back in the far north. She's nearly dry. But in the process, Anaerion suffered a mortal wound, and it's said that his final act was to board his exhausted and dying dragon, fly it back to that northern island and the Shrine of Cain, and with his last breath sheathe the sword of murder once more back in that black basalt rock at the heart of the Shrine of Cain before expiring. Certainly none ever saw him again. The princes then, of course, of Ulthuan needed a new leader. They'd had this Phoenix King, and they wanted a new representative to go forth into the Shrine of Assuran and step into the flames of the Phoenix and be crowned as the new Phoenix King. And many called for Anaerion's son, for Malekith, to be the individual who would step into the heart of the flame and be renewed and be reborn as their Phoenix King. But others were wary about the idea of creating a dynasty. And they said instead that a king should be chosen on his worth. And while worthy Malekith was, to all their intents and purposes, to all their eyes, there were others who argued that Bel-Shannar, the Prince of Tyrion, was more worthy than Malekith. And the votes, that Malekith himself spoke on Bel-Shannar's behalf and was the first to bend the knee to him. There was also great rejoicing when it was discovered that the firstborn twins of Anaerion still lived. And his daughter in particular, Yvain, was eventually wed to Bel-Shannar, becoming the next ever queen, and thus him the next Phoenix King. And he stepped into the flames of the Shrine of Assuran and was found worthy, emerging the side, and so was crowned and ruled for over 1,300 years. I mean, a massive, over a millennia of rule then, in which Ulthuan prospered. And everything was kind of renewed, chaos was driven back, and there was a great period of exploration during that time. Bel-Shannar had been a famed seafarer, and new satellite colonies were set up across the old world throughout what would eventually become Bretonia and the Empire, all the way down to the southernmost coasts, to the City of Dusk and the City of Dawn on the southernmost tip of the Southlands and of Illustria, which essentially controlled then all sea traffic along the southernmost routes around the old world. During this time, Malekith travelled extensively. He travelled to the old world and was the first to make friends with the dwarves. King Gotrek, the king of the dwarves, the Whitebeard, became a great friend of Malekith, and bonds of loyalty were sworn between them, which would take a very long time to be sundered. And meanwhile, Morathi, back in Nagaraith, essentially lived up the high life. There was a cult of luxury, a cult of pleasure that began to take prominence, in particular in Nagaraith, but also throughout Elven society. There was a sense, I suppose, that with the war over, there was nothing now to challenge them except their own pleasures. And this was viewed with askance in some respects by Bel-Shannar, who was wary about this level of indulgence and perhaps the connection it bore to Slaanesh, the chaos god of pleasure. And eventually when Malekith returned from the old world, it was Malekith that Bel-Shannar entrusted to root out the truth of this cult of luxury, even though it meant investigating his own mother. Malekith did exactly that. He travelled extensively around Ulthuan, denouncing individuals who he said were secret Slaanesh worshippers, including his own mother. And thus he came to be trusted as this great arbiter of honesty. Yeah, you can see where this is going. Finally, he returned to the court of Bel-Shannar and was shocked to discover that Bel-Shannar himself, he declared, was a secret worshipper of Slaanesh. Bel-Shannar seemingly took his own life by poison out of shame at being exposed. Yeah, and Malekith and various others then proclaimed Malekith to be the next true Phoenix King, and there was a call for him to step into the Shrine of Assuran and claim the throne. So far, so good for Malekith, it would seem. You know, a prince who was done out of his father's throne, uncovered the truth of the usurper, and now would claim his birthright. Except, hopefully you know exactly what happened when Malekith stepped into the flames of Assuran. His corrupted heart, his jealousies, his plotting, his scheming, and his murder of the next Phoenix King were uncovered. And the flames of Assuran burned him to almost the heart of his soul. He staggered from the flames, didn't manage to pass through, a twisted, where once he had been, a long, flowing head, golden maned, handsome elven, the image of elven nobility. Now a burned and racked ruin was all that was left. He was quickly disappeared by his mother and her supporters and his supporters, and a new Phoenix King was declared, Calador the First, who was the grandson of the great dragon tamer Calador. But he wasn't accepted by the Elves of Nagarath, and thus we come to what is known as the Sundering, a great, massive chapter, really, of Elven lore, and I'm going to dive into that just as I stick a little bit of paint on this model, because her dress is now mostly dry. Just going to stick a little bit of Kislev flesh over her, very, very thinly watered down, because I'm going to eventually want her to have a very, very pale complexion. So let's just pop that on there. So, the Sundering, Elven Civil War. The followers of Malekith declared that this had been a trick by those who opposed him, that they'd in some way cast a spell to corrupt the Shrine of Ashuran, and they would not accept this new usurper, this Calador, as the rightful king. Calador, meanwhile, viewed Malekith as a murderer and wanted him captured. Terrible conflict raged across Ulthuan, and in particular on the shores of Nagarath, to the point where eventually the land itself was broken. The whole western coast of Ulthuan was shattered by the forces that were unleashed. And Tyrion in particular suffered terribly from this. Tyrion was left as a shattered ruin of islands as a result of this, but Nagarath as well. There we go, that's that flesh on. Nagarath broke up, in essence. What is left of Nagarath now is a cursed and shattered coastline. And those fortresses that were still loyal to Malekith essentially had great spells bound upon them to keep them from sinking below the waves, even as the land crumbled around them. And floated off into the sea, essentially to what will become known as the Black Arcs. These giant floating islands that could be moved around by sort of harnessing them to great sea beasts to drag them across the waves. And they made their way even further northern and west to the chill lands there, which they named Nagaroth after their lost homeland. And it was there that the shattered remains of Malekith were taken, fused into a suit of magical armour that he would never be able to remove. And he became a student of his mother's sorcery and became eventually one of the greatest elven dark mages of all time, known as the Witch King. Now, yes, again, we are heavily cribbing from Tolkien on this, but in fairness to him, I think he perhaps holds a greater claim to the title than the Witch King of Angmar, in that he is actually a witch. He is both a king and a sorcerer. So, yeah, there we go. I will at some point do a full video about the Dark Elves, and we'll talk more about what happened when Malekith got there. But in the meantime, a succession of Phoenix Kings marched through history to take us through to what was really kind of the present day, what was the timeline as set out in this book, and really also what is the timeline at the point that Warhammer the Old World will be set. Some of those Phoenix Kings were great. There was a Phoenix King who was a great scholar who founded the great Tower of Sorcery in Hoeth, where magical knowledge could be taken to its very highest. There was a Phoenix King who was a great warrior who fought the good fight against the Norscan barbarians and the Orcish invaders and the creatures that came pouring down out of the heavily magically inundated circle of inner mountains. Where we are now, though, is Finnebar the Seafarer. So Finnebar the Seafarer took the throne in 2000, well, as the human calendar would reckon it. Finnebar the Seafarer took the throne in 2163. So probably about 37, 40 years before where we estimate Warhammer the Old World is likely to be set. And yeah, as you might gather from his name, he was a seafarer. He came from the southernmost kingdom of Lothern, which is the kingdom that hosts the great fortress city of Lothern that guards the entrance to the inner sea. And thus he is from one of the more powerful kingdoms, because they essentially control all trade that flows into the inner kingdoms and the wealth that flows in and out of Ulthuan. But that wasn't why he was chosen. He was also chosen because of his purity of spirit and his inherent goodness, really. Finnebar then is our Phoenix King at the point that Warhammer the Old World is set. There is one other Phoenix King that is worthy of mention. As I said, we've had Phoenix Kings who are wise, Phoenix Kings who are warriors. There is also a Phoenix King who was a fool. Calidor II. Again, but reckoning things by Imperial calendar, we're still over 1600 years before the rise of the man god Sigmar at the point that this occurs. Calidor II was not as great as his ancestor Calidor I, and certainly not as great as his ancestor Calidor the Dragon Tamer. Calidor was vain, he was arrogant, and it is during this time that an event takes place known as the War of the Beard. As I say, Malekith had become a great friend to King Gotrek, the High King of the Dwarves. He'd even gone so far as been invited in his days before his eventual immolation and corruption into Karaz-a-Karak, the very heart of the Dwarven Empire. Their gifts have been exchanged between him and King Gotrek Snowbeard. After the Sundering, after the fall of Malekith, he betrayed this friendship in essence. He directed raiders from Naggaroth to venture over to the Old World and attack Dwarven traders under the guise of still being loyal elves of Ulthuan. To the dwarves and to the men and the other kingdoms of the Old World, the Sundering was not something that was known. They were unaware of the kinstripe, essentially, that had taken place on the island of Ulthuan. And so to them, an elf was an elf. When seemingly elves of Ulthuan set upon and murdered dwarven traders, a dwarven ambassador was dispatched back to Ulthuan. It ventured all the way across the world pond to the court of the Phoenix King itself and demanded that the items that had been stolen be returned and that recompense be paid. Essentially blood gelt in some form be paid for these dwarves that had been slain, for the breaking of oaths, which, I mean, break an oath to a dwarf, yeah, you might as well kill yourself now. Calidor II laughed at the dwarven ambassador, and not only did he refuse to grant the request, but he said that he would only grant it if it was begged of him. Yeah, that didn't go down great. The word was taken back to King Gotrek. King Gotrek, in response, sacked a number of elven colonies, seized great elven treasures, and refused to return them until he, in turn, was begged. He sent word again. He sent his ambassador back to Ulthuan saying, I will only return these great treasures to you if you beg for them. Suffice to say, this did not go down well with the Phoenix King, Calidor. He shaved the dwarven ambassador, including his beard, and sent this hairless dwarf back to his king as an answer. Hence the war takes its name, and a massive, decades-long war then was fought between the forces of the kingdoms of the dwarf and the forces of the elves, until eventually Calidor II and King Gotrek met in single combat on the field of battle, and Calidor was struck down by King Gotrek. And as payment for all the wrongs that had been visited upon them, Gotrek took the crown of the Phoenix King itself as his payment and took it back to Karaz-a-Karak, where it remains today. The elves had to basically do that. They had to forge a new crown for all future Phoenix Kings because they had lost the one that had been there since the time of Anaerion because of Calidor's foolishness. And ever since, the enmity between dwarves and elves has become a staple of the background of Warhammer the Old World. Again, much, I suppose, like it was in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world, but with its own explanation as to why. So, let's go forward to Finnebar. Finnebar the Seafarer is then Phoenix King throughout the time, up until basically the end times. He has re-established sort of contact and connections with the race of man. He reaches out to extend the influence of Ulthuan across the world. He visits the Illustria. He visits even upon the shores of the Southlands. He goes to Far Cathay, hence his name, Finnebar the Seafarer. It is also during his reign that possibly the greatest threat to the High Elf realm since the Sundering takes form. Malekith launches an attack upon Ulthuan in essentially connection with vast legions of Slaneshi demons, led by a Keeper of Secrets who Anaerion himself had previously banished. Keeper of Secrets essentially known as Anaerion's Bane. He visits upon with hordes of beastmen, and they reenact almost the level of murder and destruction that was visited upon Ulthuan at the time of the Great Cataclysm, to the point where the elves lose battle after battle. They are pushed back. Malekith's army then broached into the very heart of Ulthuan to try and do as much as had happened to the first ever queen, to Anaerion's first wife, to kill her or capture her in some way, to break the spirit of the High Elves and thus once and for all crush them so that he could rule what he viewed to be his birthright. I'm going to, speaking of the Ever Queen, stick some colour on her hair over here. It was into this setting then that probably the two most famous figures in High Elf mythology enter the play. The twins Tyrion and Teclis. Two elves, both completely different and yet alike in temperament. Both certainly the epitome of perhaps what it means to be a High Elf. Tyrion, fair, fine of frame, essentially a Glorfindel in the making, a mighty elven warrior, the greatest swordsman perhaps that the elves had ever produced. His brother, twin brother Teclis, meanwhile, dark of mien and dark of hair and dark of temperament, a sickly child from birth, and everything really that his brother was not. Scholarly, physically weak, but still with that same inner fire that Tyrion displayed. Both brothers, incidentally, unlike as perhaps sometimes happens in fantasy, no jealousy or enmity between them, it would seem. Both brothers still, you know, very much a pair, very much a strong fraternal bond. There we go. That's the hair done on there. So into this setting then, Tyrion ventures into Avalon and plucks the Ever Queen, Allarielle, the Elder Queen that I am painting right now, from the very moment of death, from before a Beastman horde can murder her, and squirrels her away into the undergrowth of the forests of Avalon, hidden and assisted by some of the tree men that still live there. When word reached the Phoenix King Finnebar that the Ever Queen seemingly had been slain, it really tore the heart out of the High Elf resistance, and that was the point when it seemed as though everything was going to come to an end. That was going to be the end of Ulthuan. It's at this moment that Tyrion, who'd been studying magic for many years at the Tower of Sorcery in Hoeth, essentially declared his intention to leave, even though his training was not complete. He was given permission by the great sort of sorcerer masters there to leave, and in fact they gave him their blessing, giving him the great war crown of Sapphire, the most potent magical artifact they had to assist him in his quest. He forged for himself his own sword, the Sword of Teclis, which is a magic item in the Magic Item book, to aid him in his quest, and using his source of power travelled to Avalon, where 4 Dark Elf assassins that had been dispatched by Malekith and guided there by a sort of black orb of sorcery, were at the point of killing Tyrion and Allarielle. And at this moment, Teclis arrives on the scene, tears them apart with his magic, and then uses his sorcery to return Tyrion to life. The two brothers and Allarielle then travel to the southern coast of Avalon, meet up with the rest of Allarielle's Maiden Guard bodyguard, and sail down to the Shrine of Isha. And it's then really that the kind of the resistance is organised by the High Elves, led by the Ever Queen and her chosen champions, Tyrion and Teclis. They rout the Chaos Horde, they liberate Lothern that was under siege and free the Phoenix King, and then the battle is set for a final climactic showdown against the forces of Chaos and Malekith, against the final kind of everything the High Elves have got on the Battle of Finneval Plain. And it's here then that the fate of the High Elves is decided. Allarielle grants her blessings to Tyrion and Teclis. She gives Teclis the staff of Lilith, the goddess of wisdom and sorcery. To Tyrion, meanwhile, she grants the Heart of Avalon, a magical artifact that she had been using to keep him alive even though he'd been mortally wounded. Meanwhile, the Phoenix King gifts Tyrion the very armour that Anaerion wore that had been found abandoned on the island of Cain. And so the High Elf and the Dark Elf armies meet on the Battle of Finneval Plain. Tyrion is slaughtering his way. Nothing really can stand in his way. Malekith dispatches the Keeper of Secrets, the Anaerion's Bane, to try and slay him, but he still holds off. Malekith's greatest champion issues a challenge to all the nobility of the High Elves. Whoever can slay him, Urian Heartseeker. And every High Elf prince that steps up is instantly butchered. The King of Calador killed. The Prince of Tyrion slain. Tyrion steps up and the battle rages between the two of them for an hour until it seems that Tyrion has stumbled and that surely the Dark Elf assassin will kill him. This is merely, though, a feint by Tyrion to leave himself momentarily open to get the Dark Elf to drop his guard so he can run him through the heart. Teclis, meanwhile, ascends on a pillar of fire and battles all his magical might against that of the Witch King, throwing everything he's got at him. He banishes the Keeper of Secrets that the Witch King has unleashed back to the realm of chaos. But everything he tries is thwarted by Malekith, and it's the best that Tyrion can do to hold his own and prevent Malekith from bringing his magical might to bear upon the bulk of the High Elf army. Even then, though, with everything they're doing, with all the might of Allarielle and Finnabar thrown into the mix, it's still not enough. The Dark Elves outnumber them, and it looks as though they're going to be defeated. And it's at this moment that Teclis uses the Staff of Lilith and draws upon the magic contained there within to unleash an unstoppable bolt of energy at Malekith that pierces through his armour, and Malekith realises that unless he takes immediate action, that's it, he's going to be dead forever. He's going to be as if he hadn't existed. So he opens a portal to the realm of chaos and steps through, sealing it behind him, abandoning his army. Tyrion, meanwhile, cuts his way through to Malekith's battle standard bearer and chops him down, causing the Witch King's standard to fall. And this really is the sign then to the Dark Elves, who moments before had thought themselves on the cusp of victory. Seeing their lord and master fleeing, seeing his standard cast down, they in turn run away and are cut down by the victorious High Elf army. And you would think that that's it. Ulthuan is saved. That would be the end of the story. But there's more, and this is where we come into Warhammer the Old World as is coming. Even at that moment when the Dark Elves and the Chaos Army are banished from the shores of Ulthuan, an emissary arrives, an ambassador from the Emperor, from Magnus the Pious, declaiming that a great host of chaos has come pouring out of the north and is in danger of overrunning the old world. He begs for help from the elves, but they've still, they're so weak at this point, there's very little they can spare. And in the end, it's only Teclis and two of his sorcerer brothers who agree to go with the human ambassador back to the Empire to lend their support. And it's their magic that they're eventually able to use to turn the tide against the forces of chaos. And afterwards, the Emperor Magnus the Pious begs Teclis to stay in the Empire and teach mankind the secret of magic, so that they can be a bulwark against chaos going forward. And Teclis agrees, and it's thus that the colleges of magic are established, which form such a vital part, really, of the old world history. Up until this point, it was nothing more than sorcerers and hedge witches. But ever afterwards, the College of Magic, established by Teclis over 20 years in Altdorf, becomes this centre of magical learning. And it's from that even things like in Blood Bowl, we get the various colleges of magic for College Bowl, for Dungeon Bowl. It's all this element that arises out of the actions of Teclis. But yeah, so that's in a nutshell. That's the High Elves background. There's a lot more we could go into. We could talk perhaps about Athil Anar, the Shadow King, the replacement for Malekith, who took over Nagaraith. We could talk about Eltharion. I've done a whole video on the Atharion the Grim when he appeared in White Dwarf, but there's more that we could talk about. But I think that is the most vital parts that we can talk about from the High Elf lore. Allarielle's hair is still drying, her skin is there. If you take a look on my Twitter feed or my Instagram, I'll put a picture of her up on there when she's finished. And in the meantime, I've got a whole bunch of more stuff coming on this channel in the near future, so make sure you click the subscribe button. I've got something really big in the works with two of my friends from my Tale of Four Gamers that I'm hoping to have ready as a special around Christmas time. And I've got something as well just about hobby motivation and stress and how to deal with it that'll be coming to this channel soon. And of course, there's the next part of my interview with Nick Davis from the pages of White Dwarf. Yeah, so lots to come. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. As ever, I will catch you next time. Bye for now.